The suspect in a 40-year-old cold case from Sunnyvale was brought back to the Bay Area from Hawaii over the weekend. But just as Gary Ramirez was set to face a judge this afternoon, his lawyer announced he had a medical condition and could not appear.
September 3rd, 1982. A delivery driver pulls his truck into a lot behind a restaurant on El Camino Real in Sunnyvale, California. It's a routine stop. Same lot he's pulled into 100 mornings before this one. Same time. Same dead quiet that commercial strips have right before the first businesses open. Then he sees her. A girl, 15 years old, thrown over a 4-foot cinder block wall like something somebody didn't want found, stabbed dozens of times. Her own clothes used to bind her wrists, her makeup scattered in the dirt around her, like she'd been getting ready for a night out somewhere, before all of this happened to her instead. Blood runs down the wall behind her. More blood sits on the ledge on top of it, the spot where her killer climbed over to get away. He'd cut himself, his own knife. He left a piece of himself behind that morning without even realizing it. That blood had his DNA in it. It would sit in an evidence locker for 40 years, not because the science to read it didn't exist yet, because the man it belonged to had never been arrested. Not once, not anywhere, not for anything, in his entire life. He was a ghost the system had no reason to go looking for. This is the story of how they finally found him anyway. If you're new here, this is Apex Case Files, and we tell the real ones, the cases that take decades, the ones that get solved by accident, by obsession, by a piece of evidence nobody knew what to do with yet. If that's your kind of story, go ahead and hit subscribe before we go any further, because what happens 40 years after this morning in that parking lot is going to surprise you. Her name was Karen Ann Stitt. 6 months before that morning behind the restaurant, Karen's life had already been broken once. She'd grown up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a regular kid in a regular neighborhood, the middle child between an older sister, Suzanne, and an older brother, Robert. Nothing about her childhood marked her out as a girl a true crime show would ever be talking about 40 years later. That's worth sitting with for a second, actually. Most of the people in these stories were just living ordinary lives right up until the moment they weren't. In March of 1982, Karen's mother, Catherine Marie Lecheski Stitt, died by suicide in their hometown. Karen was 14. Suzanne was 17. Robert was older still. In a single week, the three of them lost the parent they had grown up with, the one who'd been there for the everyday stuff, the school mornings, the small fights, all of it. Grief like that doesn't really have a neat next step. There's no instruction manual for what 3 teenagers do the week after their mother dies. What actually happened was distance. Their father, Robert Stitt III, was 3,000 miles away in Palo Alto, California, so that's where they went. Not because anyone had a plan for it, and not because it solved anything, because it was the only direction left to move in. The new house sat on the quiet side of Palo Alto, west of El Camino Real, the kind of neighborhood where the streets dead end into school playgrounds and the front yards have actual oak trees growing in them. A world away from Pittsburgh in basically every sense. Karen finished out her freshman year at Palo Alto High School and stayed through that whole summer, trying, as her sister Suzanne would later describe it to a reporter, to get the family back together. Suzanne used that phrase more than once over the years. Getting the family back together. Like it was a project. Like if they just kept showing up for each other long enough, it would eventually feel normal again. And for a 14-year-old who'd just lost her mother and her zip code in the same year, Karen managed something most adults couldn't have. She adjusted. She made friends fast, the way some kids just do. She had that gear in her that some people have and some people don't. Classmates who remembered her later described someone funny, a little bit stubborn, the kind of girl who'd talk to anyone and somehow make it feel easy. None of that shows up in a case file. It only ever shows up in the people who knew her. And by the time anyone was asking them about it, it was already in the past tense. By the start of her sophomore year, she had a boyfriend, a 17-year-old named David Woods who lived one city over, in Sunnyvale. She learned the bus route down El Camino Real well enough that her family stopped worrying about her riding it alone, late, by herself, across 2 cities. It had become routine. That's the thing about routine. It's exactly the cover a stranger needs. Quick question for you. Where are you watching this from? Drop your city down in the comments. I'm always curious how far one of these stories ends up traveling by the time the video's done. because El Camino Real in 1982 was its own kind of place. It ran the length of the peninsula, from San Francisco all the way down to San Jose. 40-some miles of car dealerships, fast food joints, motels, and retail stores lit up by neon and sodium streetlight. The kind of strip that never really goes dark, just dimmer. Buses ran late along the line, well past midnight. The stops sat close enough together that you could get off practically anywhere on the strip and walk to wherever you actually needed to be. To a 15-year-old, it probably felt like freedom, a whole corridor of independence between her dad's quiet street and her boyfriend's neighborhood. It was also an easy road to disappear on. Nobody knew that part yet. This was the Bay Area in 1982, a few years before anyone started calling it Silicon Valley out loud. The orchards that used to cover most of the peninsula were mostly gone by then, replaced by office parks and tract housing and the first wave of tech companies nobody had heard of yet. It was suburban. It was supposed to be safe. Parents let their teenagers ride city buses alone at night because nothing here had ever taught them not to. That sense of safety wasn't naive, exactly. It was just about to be proven wrong by a man none of them had ever heard of, who had no connection to Karen at all, except for the fact that, on one particular night, their paths happened to cross. Thursday, September 2nd, 1982. The last week before school started back up, that specific stretch of late summer where everyone's trying to squeeze the last bit of freedom out of the season before homework and bus schedules and homeroom take it all back. Karen caught the bus from Palo Alto down to Sunnyvale that evening to see David Woods. The two of them spent the night doing what teenagers up and down the peninsula did when they had a few dollars in their pockets and nowhere they actually had to be. They played video games at a 7-Eleven on the strip, quarters lined up on the cabinet, the hum of the machines, that fluorescent convenience store glow. They walked over to Golfland afterward and played a round of miniature golf under the lights. Then they just hung around the parking lot for a while, the way you do at that age, when the night doesn't have an ending built into it yet, and you're not in any hurry to find one. Karen was wearing a leather jacket, a striped shirt, and a baseball cap Woods had handed her at some point that night. A Rush ball cap, the rock band's insignia stitched across the front. The kind of thing a girl wears home not because she likes the band particularly, but because the boy she's seeing just put it on her head, and it felt nice to wear it. Around 12:30 in the morning, Woods started walking Karen toward the bus stop at the corner of El Camino Real and South Wolf Road. She was going to catch the bus back to Palo Alto, back to her father's house, same as always, same route she'd ridden dozens of times that summer. He didn't walk her the rest of the way. He turned around partway there, ran home. He was worried about his curfew, about what his parents would say if he came in too late on a school night. He told police afterward that he'd felt bad about it almost immediately, that some part of him knew he was leaving a 15-year-old girl alone on a commercial strip after midnight. But he said he hadn't believed she was in any real danger. It was a quiet street. She'd done this walk before. It was just a few more minutes to the stop. That was the last time anyone who knew Karen Stitt saw her alive. The next morning, that delivery driver found her behind the Honey Bee restaurant, a spot on the El Camino Strip, about 100 yards from the bus stop where Woods had left her. 100 yards. Less than a city block from where she should have been safely waiting for a bus. David Woods's Rush ball cap was lying in the dirt right next to her body, the one piece of him that had made it that far with her. Sunnyvale Department of Public Safety detectives were on scene within the hour, and what they found told them two things almost immediately. First, whoever did this had been close enough, and angry enough, or scared enough, to stab her more than 50 times. That's not the kind of number that comes from a stranger passing through. That's a number that tells you something about rage, or panic, or both. Second, he'd left a piece of himself behind without meaning to. He'd cut his own hand climbing back over that wall to get away, and his blood had mixed with hers on the concrete, on the cinder blocks, on her own body. In 1982, a crime lab could type blood, figure out whether it was A, B, AB, or O, the same basic categories used for transfusions. That narrowed a suspect pool from everyone on Earth down to maybe a third or a quarter of it. It was something. It was nowhere close to enough. In 2022, that would be the difference between an unsolved murder and a name. In 1982, it was just blood. The technology to read a DNA profile out of a few cells and match it to one specific human being on Earth didn't exist yet. Not in any police department, not anywhere in the world. They preserved the evidence anyway, bagged it, sealed it, logged it, stored it. Somebody in that department had the foresight, or maybe just the stubbornness, to save evidence for a future that hadn't even been invented yet. That decision is the entire reason this story has an ending at all. Somewhere across town that same morning, Karen's father got a phone call no parent is ever prepared for. He'd already lost his wife 6 months earlier. Now he had to find a way to tell 2 more children that their sister wasn't coming home, that the family that had crossed the country trying to put itself back together had just lost another piece of itself, this time with no warning at all. There's no version of that conversation that goes gently. There wasn't one here either. If this is the part where your stomach drops a little, yeah, same. Drop a comment and let me know, because it's about to get worse before it gets better. Detectives canvassed every business on that stretch of El Camino, the motels, the bars, the gas stations, the all-night convenience stores, all the places that would have had eyes on the road in the small hours. They interviewed cab drivers, bus drivers, anyone who might have been out on that road during the dead hours after midnight when almost nobody legitimate has a reason to be. One witness, a machinist working a late shift that night, remembered something odd, a white, old-fashioned panel truck with a stripe down the side, parked near where Karen's body was later found, parking lights still on, just sitting there in the dark. It looked out of place on a commercial strip after midnight. Not a delivery truck doing a delivery, not a car parked for any reason he could think of. He hadn't thought much of it in the moment. By morning it was gone. It was never identified. To this day, it's still never been identified, and nobody knows for certain whether it had anything to do with what happened to Karen, or whether it was simply a stranger's truck on a stranger's night. And then there was David Woods. He was the last person to see Karen alive. He'd walked her toward the stop and then left her alone in the dark. He cooperated with police completely, gave his account of the whole night down to the smallest detail, sat through follow-up interview after follow-up interview, answered every question they had, denied any involvement in what happened after he turned around. But investigators couldn't place him at the crime scene, and they couldn't fully clear him either, not with what they had in 1982. No witness saw him double back. No physical evidence tied him to the wall, the blood, any of it. But none of that was the same as proof he hadn't done it. And in a small community that had just watched a 15-year-old girl get murdered 100 yards from a bus stop, that gap was more than enough to keep a teenage boy under a cloud for years. People in town knew his name, knew he'd been the boyfriend, knew he'd been the one who left her there. Whatever sympathy he might have gotten as someone who'd also lost Karen got tangled up, permanently, with suspicion he couldn't shake. So for the next 18 years, David Woods lived under the weight of being the primary person of interest in the murder of a girl he'd been dating when she died. Imagine carrying that. Not just the grief of losing someone you cared about, but the suspicion sitting right alongside it, for almost 2 decades, with no way to prove it wrong. No DNA test yet capable of clearing his name once and for all. The case went into the cold file. Every few years, a new detective would inherit the box, read through everything that was there, and run into the same dead end everyone before them had run into. No new leads, no new witnesses. Just an unidentified truck and a boyfriend nobody could fully clear. It wasn't forgotten locally, even when it went quiet officially. Local papers ran anniversary pieces every 5 or 10 years, the kind of story that resurfaces every time a milestone hits. 10 years gone, 20 years gone, 30. Parents in Palo Alto and Sunnyvale used Karen's name, whether they meant to or not, as the reason their own kids weren't allowed to ride the bus alone after dark anymore. A murder like this doesn't just take one person. It rewrites the rules for an entire community for years afterward, usually without anyone ever announcing that it's happening. Quick one for you. What time is it where you're watching this right now? Drop it below, because where this story is about to go, time is kind of the whole point of it. Karen's sister Suzanne carried this case the way some people carry grief, like a second job nobody hired her for and nobody was ever going to pay her to do. She'd been 18 when Karen was killed. The same sister who'd spent the summer of 1982 trying to glue her family back together after their mother's death, now spent the rest of her life trying to find out who'd taken her sister too. She spread Karen's ashes over Mount Tamalpais, a peak north of the Golden Gate Bridge, where the family used to hike together back when there were still 4 of them. She moved to Eugene, Oregon as an adult, married a man named John Musumechi, became a stepmother to his 3 kids, built an entire second life for herself in the Pacific Northwest, the kind of life that looks, from the outside, like someone who's moved on. But she hadn't, not really, and the whole time, she kept showing up. Through her 20s, her 30s, into her 40s. New detectives would take over the file every few years, and Suzanne would sit down with them, walk them through Karen's life and her routine, and the people in her orbit. The same information, over and over, to a rotating cast of investigators who were always starting from zero. She gave interviews when reporters circled back to the case every 5 or 10 years, the way local papers do with cold cases, keeping Karen's name from disappearing entirely from public memory. She gave the family's blessing for every new test, every new technology investigators wanted to try on the evidence, because some part of her understood that the answer was probably going to come from a lab eventually, not from a tip or a confession. She built a normal life in Oregon on top of all of this. A marriage, a step-family, a job, a community that had no idea, most days, that she was also quietly running a 30-year campaign for her dead sister, 3 states away. It never came in time for her. In March of 2013, Suzanne died of ovarian cancer at her home in Eugene, Oregon. She was 49 years old, 30 years of pushing for an answer, of being the one person in the family who refused to let the case go quiet, and she died without one. She never got to hear the name Gary Ramirez. She never got to sit in that courtroom. Karen's father didn't get an answer either. He passed away in the years between his daughter's death and the day her killer was finally caught. Another person this case took something from, long before it ever gave anything back. But before all of that, in 2018, something did happen. Something small, but it mattered. Investigators pulled the DNA profile from the evidence collected at the scene back in 1982, the blood off that wall, the biological material recovered from Karen's body, and ran it through CODIS, the FBI's national DNA database built specifically to catch repeat offenders by matching crime scene evidence against the profiles of people already convicted of qualifying crimes. Nothing came back. Whoever left that blood had never been convicted of a single qualifying offense, anywhere in the country. Not one. But the same testing did something else, something quieter, but just as important. Investigators compared that same DNA profile to a sample provided by David Woods. It didn't match. After 18 years as the prime suspect in his teenage girlfriend's murder, David Woods was finally, definitively cleared. The killer wasn't someone Karen knew. He wasn't a boyfriend, an ex, a neighbor with a grudge, anyone with a motive that made some kind of human sense. He was a total stranger who crossed her path on one ordinary night in September of 1982 and then simply walked off the face of the earth, at least as far as any database on the planet could tell. If you've ever wondered why true crime fans get so obsessed with cases like this one, this is exactly why. The DNA is sitting right there, in a freezer, in an envelope, clean, specific, scientifically perfect, and completely useless, because it doesn't match anyone the system has ever heard of. For David Woods, the clearance came almost 20 years too late to undo what 18 years of suspicion had already done to his life, but it was still, finally, the truth in writing. He was free of it in a way he'd never fully been before, even though no court had ever formally charged him with anything. If you're enjoying this one so far, send it to someone who'd appreciate that kind of gut punch, because the part where it finally pays off is coming up. In 2017, a Sunnyvale detective named Matt Hutchison pulled the file off the shelf. Hutchison had grown up in that exact part of Sunnyvale. His stepfather had worked for the department. The murder of Karen Stitt wasn't some case number to him, some folder in a filing cabinet. It was part of the city's history, something that had been sitting in the background of his entire life, the kind of local story that gets mentioned at dinner tables for decades. He believed the department owed victims an answer no matter how old the file was, no matter how many other detectives had already tried and failed. Cold case work is a strange kind of job, when you think about it. You're not chasing someone who's actively running. You're not racing a clock in the way patrol officers are. You're just sitting with a box of someone else's worst day, year after year, hoping the rest of the world eventually catches up to what's already sitting inside it. And he knew something the original investigators in 1982 never had: a DNA profile sitting in cold storage that nobody had ever had the tools to actually use, just waiting for technology to catch up to it. In early 2019, he got a tip. The specifics of that tip were never made public, and probably never will be. But what it did was narrow the entire field of possible suspects down to one family. 4 brothers, all from Fresno, a city about 150 miles southeast of Sunnyvale, out in California's Central Valley. A completely different world from the Tech Corridor Peninsula where Karen had lived. None of the 4 brothers had a record. None of them had ever been on a suspect list, not in 1982, not in any year since. They were exactly the kind of people a 1982 investigation would have had absolutely no reason to look at. If you've ever driven through the Central Valley in late summer, you know what that part of California feels like. Flat, dry, the kind of heat that just sits on your shoulders all day and doesn't let up until well after dark. What's the weather like where you are right now? Tell me in the comments. Because 4 ordinary men from an ordinary town out in the valley were about to become the only real lead this case had ever had in 40 years. Hutchison didn't have a name. He had a family. And turning a family into a name meant using a tool that hadn't existed when Karen was killed, and barely existed when Hutchison was first handed the case. The technique is called forensic genetic genealogy. It's the same method that had identified the Golden State Killer the year before, and in the years since, it's gone on to crack cold cases all over the country. Murders, rapes, unidentified remains, sitting unsolved for decades for the exact same reason this one was. The DNA existed, but nobody it belonged to had ever ended up in a criminal database. It works almost nothing like the kind of DNA matching most people picture from crime shows. There's no machine that spits out a name on a screen. Hutchison partnered with a professional genealogist, and together they uploaded the killer's unknown DNA profile into public genealogy databases, the same ones millions of completely ordinary people use to track down ancestors and discover long-lost cousins they didn't know existed. The system didn't return a suspect. It returned distant relatives, people who shared just enough genetic markers with the unknown killer to register as 3rd or 4th cousins, people going about their normal lives with absolutely no idea they were related to anyone connected to a 40-year-old murder. From that starting point, the genealogist began building a family tree outward, one branch at a time. Marriage records, birth certificates, immigration documents, old newspaper obituaries, the slow, unglamorous paper trail that exists in courthouse basements and county registries everywhere, the kind of research that has nothing to do with labs or microscopes and everything to do with patients. Marker by marker, generation by generation, the tree narrowed, branch by branch falling away as they didn't fit, until what was left started to look like an answer. Think of it like this. Imagine you found a single drop of someone's blood, and you had no idea whose it was. Genetic genealogy can't point straight at that person. What it can do is find their 3rd cousin twice removed, currently living a completely unrelated life in another state, who happened to mail in a saliva kit out of curiosity about their own family history. From that one stranger, a genealogist can work backward and outward, through generations of records, until the branches of the tree converge on a much smaller group of living people. It's slow, it's indirect, and in this case, it took 2 full years to get there. By 2021, the tree had narrowed all the way down to exactly the family that original tip had pointed toward back in 2019. The man who killed Karen Stitt was one of 4 brothers from Fresno. But here's the part the genealogy still couldn't do. It couldn't tell them which one. Brothers share too much DNA with each other for genetic markers alone to separate them. The science can put you in the right house on the right street. It can't point you at the one chair in that house where the right man is sitting. That's where the science stopped, and the actual, old-fashioned police work started. Hutchison spent months tracking all 4 brothers through every public record he could get his hands on. Obituaries, marriage announcements, old military service files, anything with a name and a date attached to it. Social media filled in the rest of the picture in a way 1982 detectives could never have imagined. Through Facebook, of all things, he located one of the brothers' grandchildren, and through that single connection, he traced his way to the next generation down. the adult children of all four brothers, the people who might unknowingly be holding the exact evidence he needed in their own DNA. What he needed now was a direct comparison. A child carries roughly half of a parent's genetic material. Test that child's DNA profile against the unknown blood recovered from the crime scene back in 1982, and the result either confirms the father as the likely source, or it crosses him off the list completely. On April 8, 2022, Hutchison obtained a DNA sample from one of the brothers' children. The Santa Clara County District Attorney's crime lab ran the comparison. The result? A very high probability that this person's father was the man who killed Karen Stitt. That father had a name: Gary Gene Ramirez. Ramirez was 75 years old. He was living in Makawao, a small town up on the slopes of a volcano on the island of Maui, about 2,500 miles from the parking lot where Karen's body had been found 4 decades earlier. As far from that crime scene as a person can get, and still technically be in the United States. He had no criminal record, not one arrest, anywhere, for anything, across his entire adult life. On paper, he was just a retired pest control worker living out a quiet retirement in Hawaii. The kind of guy you'd nod to at the hardware store and never think about again. He'd grown up in Fresno, gone to high school there like his brothers, served in the U.S. Air Force in the early 70s. After he got out of the military, he moved around for a while, the Bay Area, San Francisco, San Diego, Colorado, before finally settling on Maui for good, where he stayed for decades, building a normal, anonymous, completely unremarkable life. Picture it for a second. Makawao is a small upcountry town, all Paniolo storefronts and eucalyptus trees, the kind of place tourists drive through on the way up to watch the sunrise from the volcano. Ramirez lived there for years as just another local face, somebody's neighbor, somebody's coworker, the guy who showed up and dealt with your termite problem. Nobody on that island had any reason to connect him to a murder on a California commercial strip from before most of his neighbors were even born. His older brother, Rudy, who also lived on Maui, told a reporter afterward that he simply couldn't believe what his younger brother had been accused of. Said he'd never once seen him angry in his life. Said he was about the gentlest, most easygoing person he'd ever known. That's the face this case had been staring at for 40 years without ever actually seeing it. Not a monster in the obvious sense. Not someone with a record, a history, a pattern anyone could point to. A man who had committed one of the most violent crimes in Sunnyvale's history at some point in his 20s, and then simply lived out the rest of his life, clean on every record that mattered, in plain sight, on a beautiful island, while a family 3,000 miles away spent 4 decades wondering if they'd ever know his name. On August 2nd, 2022, officers arrested Gary Ramirez at his home in Makawao. It had taken months of planning to get to that point. Santa Clara County, Maui Police, federal law enforcement, all coordinated together, funded largely by a 2021 Department of Justice grant, specifically built to fund exactly this kind of cold case investigation. The kind that takes years and resources most departments simply don't have lying around. By every account, Ramirez didn't run, didn't fight. When detectives told him why they were there, his reaction was reportedly quiet, stunned disbelief. The sound, more or less, of a man realizing that something he'd outrun for 40 years had finally, somehow, caught up to him in a small town on the side of a volcano on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. No standoff, no denial that made the papers. Just an old man in a doorway, watching 40 years of being nobody in particular end in the space of a few seconds. Investigators obtained a direct DNA sample from him after the arrest. This time, straight from the man himself, no genealogy required. The crime lab confirmed what the child's sample had already pointed toward back in April. It wasn't a probability anymore. It was a match. Ramirez waived extradition. He was flown back across the Pacific and booked into the Santa Clara County Jail on August 20th, 2022, charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and rape in the death of Karen Stitt. 3 charges, 4 decades late, finally attached to an actual name and an actual face. 40 years. And the case finally had someone to answer for it. At the press conference that followed the arrest, Hutchison said something that should probably unsettle you a little. He told reporters he believed it was possible, not certain, but possible, that Ramirez had crossed paths with other victims over the decades. People who had never been connected to him, cases that might still be sitting unsolved somewhere else entirely. He asked anyone with information about the man to come forward. 40 years of an apparently quiet life is a long time. Nobody investigating this case could promise that Karen Stitt was the only name attached to it. On February 24, 2025, Gary Ramirez stood in a Santa Clara County courtroom in a barely audible voice and pled no contest to first-degree murder. A no-contest plea carries the same legal weight as a guilty one in terms of sentencing. It simply means the defendant isn't required to admit out loud, on the record, to the specific facts of the crime. He was 78 years old by then. Long gray hair, a cane. The man standing in that courtroom bore almost no resemblance to the 20-something who had climbed over a cinder block wall on El Camino Real back in 1982. Blood on his hands. 4 decades of an ordinary life still ahead of him that he had no right to. On May 12, 2025, Judge Hanley Chu handed down the sentence, 25 years to life, with the possibility of parole. It was the maximum the plea allowed for. At 78 years old, Ramirez would be over 100 before he was even eligible to ask for release. For all practical purposes, everyone in that courtroom understood it for what it actually was. A life sentence, just dressed up in the language of parole eligibility that would never realistically apply. District Attorney Jeff Rosen put it simply in a statement afterward. Karen Stitt, he said, had lost her life more than 40 years earlier, but she had never once been forgotten. Karen's family and friends filled the courtroom that day, decades of grief finally given somewhere to sit. David Woods, the boyfriend who'd walked her partway to that bus stop and turned back, was there too, 43 years removed from a decision he likely replayed in his head more times than anyone could count. So was Michael Calhoun, another boyfriend from that same summer, a man who'd fallen for Karen before her death and later became a police officer largely because of what happened to her, a career built directly out of one unsolved murder. He'd held onto a copper ring she'd once given him for 43 years, kept it through every move, every job, every decade, the kind of object that turns into a kind of anchor without anyone planning it that way. He told the court that yes, some relief had finally come now that her killer had a name and a cell number attached to him. But closure, in his own words, wasn't really something a loss like this allowed for. No verdict was bringing Karen back. And everyone sitting in that room already understood that, better than anyone watching from the outside ever could. Karen's best friend, Tracy Lancaster, spoke about the one question she'd carried around for 43 years, through every part of her own adult life, through her own marriages and jobs and milestones, that Karen never got to have. Not how he did it, not even who, really, not anymore, not after everything that had already come out in the investigation. Just why? Why Karen? Why that night? A question that, even now, with a name and a sentence and a courtroom full of closure-shaped moments, nobody could actually answer for her, because the one person who might have explained it had pled no contest specifically so he'd never have to. Karen's aunt, Robin, who had outlived Karen's parents, and outlived Suzanne too, sat through all of it from somewhere in that courtroom. One of the very few people left who had known Karen as a living, breathing person, rather than a case file or a name on a news segment. She told reporters afterward that the arrest, 3 years earlier, had reopened a wound she genuinely believed had scarred over decades ago, and that somehow, impossibly, almost contradictorily, it had brought her a strange kind of peace at the exact same time. Both things true at once. That's grief for you. After 40 years of it, it doesn't resolve so much as it just learns to hold two opposite feelings in the same hand. If any part of this story has sat with you the way it's sitting with me right now, do me a favor and hit subscribe. Not just for the algorithm, though yeah, also for the algorithm. Cases like this only ever get solved because people keep paying attention to them long after almost everyone else has moved on to something else. Be one of the people still paying attention. A 15-year-old girl walked toward a bus stop on El Camino Real on a warm September night in 1982, wearing a borrowed baseball cap, thinking about nothing more complicated than catching her bus home. 100 yards away, behind a cinder block wall she hadn't even seen yet, the evidence that would eventually name her killer was already waiting there, in the blood on the concrete, in cells nobody on Earth had the ability to read yet, sitting patiently in an evidence locker through decades of birthdays nobody got to have, through a mother's death and a father's death and a sister's death, through an entire family running out before the answer ever arrived. It would wait there for 40 years, long enough for her mother to already be gone before any of it happened, long enough for her father to die without an answer, long enough for her sister to spend 30 years chasing one and still die without it, long enough for the science that finally cracked the case to not even exist yet on the morning it happened, decades away from being invented by people who had no idea they were working toward Karen Stitt's name. 40 years. That's how long it took for that wall to finally tell on him. And maybe that's the part of this whole story worth sitting with longest. Not the DNA, not the genealogy, not even the courtroom. Just the fact that the truth was physically present at that scene the entire time. It never moved. It never degraded past the point of use. It simply waited in a building somewhere in Sunnyvale for the rest of the world to become capable of asking it the right question. Everyone who loved Karen Stitt grew older without an answer. The evidence didn't age at all. If this one stuck with you, let me know down in the comments. And if you want more cases like this, the full solved cold case playlist is linked right below. I'll see you in the next one.